If you have ever struggled with weird resizing behaviors, elements overflowing with each other, or just want to make your website responsive like almost every website out there, then you need to watch this video. Flexbox, an amazing and one of the most important CSS features that allows you to create complex and flexible layouts. Using Flexbox, you can easily design responsive websites that look great on any device, all with just a few lines of code. Also stick around to the end of the video for a bonus that will help you firm up your Flexbox knowledge. Our journey starts with the HTML file. Here we have a container with 3 elements. The container plays an important role since the main idea behind a Flexbox is to give the container an ability to align and lay out its children for the best and most effective use of its space. Also note that any element that can hold any content can be a Flex container, while any element can be a Flex item. Jumping to the CSS file, we ignore all the preparational code that simply designs the Flex container and its Flex items. We see that each Flex item lies on a separate line taking up the entire horizontal space. That's because the display of many elements by default is set to block. But that changes as soon as we call the container and set its display to Flex. It causes the Flex items to accumulate at the top left corner, side by side in a row direction. They line in a row direction because of the Flex direction property set to row by default. Changing it to column value, we get the items lined in a column direction now. We change it back to row, or simply remove it since it's the default value. The most important concept when working with Flexbox is to understand the main axis and the cross axis along which the Flex container positions its children. The main axis is the primary axis of the Flexbox container, which is defined by the Flex direction property, and by default it ranges horizontally from left to right. The cross axis though is perpendicular to the main axis, which vertically stretches from top to bottom by default. So to position the Flex items along the main axis, we use justify content property, which is set to Flex start by default. For that reason, the items lie at the top left corner by default. Changing it to Flex end causes the items jump to the end of the line. Center centralizes the items. Space between evenly distributes the items along the main axis, with the first item on the start line and the last item on the end line. Space around does the same but with half spaces around the edges. Space evenly distributes the space around each item, including the edges. To align the Flex items along the cross axis though, we use align items property. Flex start lies the items at the start of the cross axis. Flex end makes the items jump to the end of the cross axis. Center centralizes the items. Baseline simply aligns the items along the baseline, which is typically this line under the texts. To see it visually, let's give different heights and font sizes to each Flex item. Having a unique height and font size, we see that they are still positioned by the text line. Finally, we have stretch value, which is the default value for the align items property. We don't see its effect due to this strict height value we gave our Flex items. If we change the height to mean height, now we see that the Flex items cover the entire cross axis. As we said, this is the default value for the align items property. That means initially if we do not give any strict sizes to the Flex items, by default they cover the entire cross size. As we mentioned earlier, the Flex direction property is set to row by default, and this is the exact property defining the axis directions. Main axis always follows Flex direction property, and the cross axis is always perpendicular to the main axis. That means if we change row to column, this flips the axis, making the main axis vertical and the cross axis horizontal. And now you have probably guessed that justify content property works vertically, and align items property positions the Flex items horizontally following their according axis. Flex direction property also has row reverse value, which flips the main axis, exchanging its start point with its end point. Now to move the Flex items back to the left edge, we have to set justify content to Flex end. The same is true for the column reverse, which causes the items to start from the bottom and then move up. We change it back to row, Now let's talk about what happens if we increase the sizes of the flex items or simply increase their number. We see that they stack in a line, shrinking to the maximum until they overflow the flex container. We can actually change this event using the flex wrap property, which is set to no wrap by default, and for that reason they stack in a line. But as soon as we change it to wrap, it allows the flex items to jump to new lines along the cross-axis while retaining their sizes, and this is called multi-line flexible container. This layout is a bit different from the typical one, since now we have several lines of flex items along the cross-axis. To position them along the cross-axis, we can still use align items property. Flex start, move them to the start, center, centralizes them, but we see that align items property is treating them as a whole and is not allowing us to control the spacing between them. To achieve that, we have to use another property called align content property, which is different from the align items. This one allows us to position these lines along the cross axis, plus giving us an ability to control the spacing between them. So flex start stacks the lines near the start of the cross axis, flex end near the end of the cross axis, center centralizes them, space between evenly distributes the space between the lines, but not near edges. To do near edges, we have to use space around, but with half spacing. Space equally distributes the space everywhere. Do you remember using row reverse value or column reverse value of the flex direction property, we flipped the main axis? Well, we can do the same for the cross axis using wrap reverse value of the flex wrap property, which exchanges the start and end points of the cross axis. So as the result, the first line of the flex items lie near the bottom of the flex container. By the way, there is another property called flex flow, which is a shorthand combining flex direction and flex wrap. First it accepts flex direction and then flex wrap property. Now we can easily get rid of the other two properties. We change wrap reverse to wrap and set align content property to flex start. And now let's talk about gaps. Row gap property sets a custom gap between the rows. So does column gap property for the columns. There's a shorthand one called gap. First it accepts a value for the row gap, then for the column gap. Give it one value, it accepts it for both of them. The Flexbox properties we have covered so far belong to the flex container. There are some other properties that we can use for each flex item individually. Before covering them, let's reset everything to the initial state. And also leave only 3 elements of the flex items. First, we talk about the flex grow property, which defines how fast one flex item grows and how much of the free space it takes compared to the other flex items. So applying it to the first item, we see that it takes up the entire free space, pushing the other two to the right. If we increase this value, we see that nothing changes. As we said, this value defines how much of the free space one takes compared to the other. That means this value is unitless and works proportionally. So applying 1 to the first item, 2 for the second, and 3 for the third, we see that the third item, having the largest value, takes up the most space, while the first box takes the least space. Similar to flex grow, there's a flex shrink, which is the opposite, and obviously this one defines how fast one item shrinks in compared to the others. Let's give our items the same value for the flex shrink. 2 for the second, 3 for the third. We open the inspect, activate the mobile mode, and start shrinking the flex container. We see that the third item is the fastest, since it has the largest values for the both properties, while the first item is the slowest. Also pay attention that the flex items are shrinking and growing along the main axis, but not along the cross axis. That said, let's talk about the next property, which is flex basis. This property defines the main size of the flex item before it grows or shrinks, As for the main size, it can be a width or height of the flex item depending on the flex direction. In other words, flex spaces overrides the width or height of the flex item. Let's give it 300 pixels. Now we see that the item got bigger by width. But if we change the flex direction to column, now the flex spaces act as a height of the flex item. However, there's a shorter version called flex property. First it accepts flex grow, then flex shrink, and then flex spaces. From the experience, I know that this approach is usually used instead of defining each of them separately. The usual values provided for the flex property are 0, 1, or auto. Auto means the flex item grows or shrinks based on the available space and also takes its initial size from the width and height or from its content. The value 1, though, does not have any initial sizes. That means its flex spaces is set to 0% and it completely depends on the flex container available space. It grows if there is a space to and shrinks if there is not. 0 sets everything to 0 and that means the flex item does not have a main size and does not grow or shrink either. We also have align self property that works exactly as the align items property of the flex container, but this one positions each flex item individually along the cross axis. Flex start near the start of the cross axis, flex end near the end of the cross axis, and center to centralize it. Finally, we have the order property that changes the order of the flex items defined in the HTML file. Order. By default, each flex item order property is set to 0. And how it works is that a flex item with a lower order value appears before an element with a higher one. We give value 2 for the first box, 3 for the second, and -3 for the third. We see that the third item appears before everyone since it has the lowest value, while the second item appears after everyone having the largest value. However, you should always avoid using this property since it changes the hierarchy defined in the HTML file, unless this is the only solution. We covered all the Flexbox properties and now let's play some games to strengthen what we have learned. Using any search engine, type Flexbox Games, which will find several options for you. Choose any website and you're good to go. We head over to the flexboxfroggy.com. From the level dropdown, we choose the 24th, which is seemed to be the hardest. We have a line of frogs that we have to position on their leaves accordingly. The first one is the red one, whose position is diagonally opposite, and that means we have to flip both axes, the main axis and the cross axis. So let's do that. Flex direction equals column reverse. Why column but not row reverse? Because we see that the frog's positions are columns. Next, let's wrap them. Flex wrap that equals wrap reverse. And now we got many of the frog's position. Let's use flex flow instead of these two properties. Flex flow. First, it equals flex direction property. And then flex wrap property. And now let's move the entire space between these two lines without any space near the edges. To do that, we use align content set to space between. Finally, we move the flex items to the center along the main axis. And to do that, we use justify content property set to center. And we did it. This was Flexbox in 15 minutes, and if you are interested in creating something cool, then do not hesitate to watch this video. Talk to you there.